My name is Michael Hansen. I'm a research associate at the Consumer Policy Institute, which is part of Consumers Union of the U.S., the publisher of Consumer Reports. Some of the concerns for genetically engineered animals is, I would say that the biggest concern that many non-governmental organizations have is we've pointed out that there actually are no firm regulations for either human safety or environmental safety testing. They haven't published anything. The federal government hasn't published any guidelines or policies for how they're going to deal with genetically engineered animals. We have the Food and Drug Administration has said that they're going to treat the genetically engineered salmon, the fish, they're going to evaluate them under the New Animal Drug Act. For the purposes of the law, they're going to consider them new animal drugs. The FDA has recently said that they hope to put out a policy statement for how they want to regulate all genetically engineered animals. That policy statement is supposed to be out in early 2002, but they're already saying that they're going to regulate it under treat engineered animals as new animal drugs. And we think that's sort of perverse way of looking at things, because I wonder whether that would even stand up in a court of law. While you could make an argument, for example, that a fish that is engineered to have a growth hormone gene in it, you might argue that, well, the growth hormone that will now being produced in the fish is a drug, and so therefore we'll consider the fish to be a drug. But even if you accept that and say for human safety testing that's okay, what about the environmental impacts of the engineered fish or of these engineered animals if they escape into the environment? The FDA doesn't really have the regulation, the statutory authority to look at the question, and they don't have the expertise either. For the higher animals, that's what the FDA has said. They're going to come out with a policy statement sometime in early 2002. And the way that works is they'll have to put out a policy statement. There'll have to be a period of time, comment period, so that any interested member of the public can comment on the policy, and then they'll have to try to finalize it, take all the comments that they get on the policy take those into account before they come up with some finished policy. But the FDA has already said it's their intention to regulate all genetically engineered animals. So not only fish, but if you want to engineer birds or cattle or sheep or any animal, they're going to regulate those as new animal drugs. Okay. And that's not, I don't think that that's appropriate. I believe that if they were challenged in a court of law, that they would probably lose, because say, for example, that you engineer a cow to put on weight more quickly so that it'll bulk up and have more meat. What rationale are you going to regulate that as a drug? It just doesn't make much sense. And also, if you look at engineered insects or arthropods, so that you can get spiders and mites and crustaceans, there is actually no policy or no regulation out there right now. And there are people that have been doing field releases for engineered arthropods. That is, for things such as engineered spider mites, or there's talk of people want to release engineered mosquitoes, and other insects. And actually, some of the people that are doing this work have suggested that there needs to be some kind of regulations, because at the moment, none really exist. And particularly, there's a concern for genetically engineered arthropods that are either vectors of animal disease or vectors of human disease. It looks like APHIS, part of the USDA, had originally said that they thought that was important and they should develop regulations for it. They now appear to be saying that, well, we don't really have statutory authority because we can only control, since we're a federal agency, we can only control things if they move across state lines. So that means if you want to do experiments on an engineered mosquito and release it just in Florida, well, if that doesn't cross state lines, then we don't have any regulatory authority. We don't think that's correct. Consumers Union doesn't. We feel that APHIS should develop regulations for engineered arthropods and for ones that are, particularly ones that are vectors of animal diseases as well. And this notion that things aren't going to cross state lines is really silly when you get to things like mosquitoes. If you release them, they're not going to stop when they come to a border and not fly across that border. So there needs to be some regulation. And then you then get into, well, what about arthropods that are engineered that are vectors of human disease? Those wouldn't be under the USDA's purview. They should probably be under the Public Health Service. So they need to be developing regulations. But at the present time, they don't exist for the insects, and they're really for the animals. The Food and Drug Administration has said that they're going to put out these regulations, but there's still concerns about environmental impacts that the FDA does not have the expertise or the authority to look at. Well, so there's a gaping loophole for there's virtually no environmental regulation to look at environmental safety of engineered insects or of engineered animals.
Okay. Now, what about the notion that the FDA especially has this revolving door with big, like Monsanto and big corporations? The executives of Monsanto then turn over and start working for the FDA, and then the
or
FDA,
vice versa.
And what kind of effects that might have on at least the public's perception?
Well, I think there has been a problem at the Food and Drug Administration with people working at the agency and then moving over into industry or to Monsanto, and sometimes there's a reverse happening with industry scientists that come in and work for the government. At the very least, that creates the appearance of a conflict of interest, and that lessens the trust that the public has in these federal agencies. So that could be a very big problem, this sort of revolving door. But I think the way the agency should work is whenever they come up with new regulations, they're required by law to publish them in the Federal Register and to have a period where anybody in the public can comment on those new regulations, and they have to take those into account when they're developing their final policies. We don't think they do it very well, but it's the best system that's out there right now.
Okay. Now, why do you think there's such a difference in the perception and the laws of genetic engineered food between America and, say, Europe or Japan?
Well, I think the main difference is in Europe you have regulations, the Novel Foods Act, that recognize that engineered foods are different and that they need to go through a special approval process, and that both environmental safety and human safety has to be looked at. In the United States, in contrast, we have a very weak regulatory system because we made a decision in the early 1980s, and around 1985 or 86, they developed something called the Coordinated Framework. And the idea there was, well, we don't need new laws to regulate the products of biotechnology. We can regulate those products with existing laws, and then what that has led to is the agencies coming up with all sorts of creative ways to at least give the appearance of doing some kind of oversight. So, for example, the USDA, APHIS, they're the ones that regulate field release, and the authority they do that under is called the Plant Pest Act. The rationale being is that, well, they want to evaluate whether these engineered organisms might be at a risk for becoming a plant pest, such as a weed, right? For engineered plants, that's what the hook is, and the agency is saying, well, since you're using bits and pieces of either the cauliflower mosaic virus, which is a plant pest, or you're using bits and pieces from a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens, which causes crown gall disease, that is another plant pest. That's how they're regulating looking at field releases. So theoretically, if you came up with an engineered organism and you didn't use bits and pieces from plant pests, they would be completely exempt from regulation. Or we look at the fact that the FDA wants to regulate fish now as new animal drugs. Or we can look at the Environmental Protection Agency saying that they're going to evaluate the release of genetically engineered microorganisms into the environment. The way those get looked at is, for the purposes of the law, they're considering them as new chemicals, and so they're regulated under TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. So what we're seeing is, with all these engineered organisms, rather than realize that they raise new and unique concerns, because, for example, if you release a genetically engineered microorganism into the environment, if you're evaluating that, treating it just like a new chemical, there's a fundamental difference. If you put a new chemical into the environment and it turns out to be hazardous, or there's a chemical accident or a spill, there's a certain contained amount of the chemical that goes out there. With living organisms, if something goes wrong, they can reproduce and spread, so that they raise different questions and they need to be evaluated in a different way. You don't evaluate an engineered microorganism to be released into the environment under a law that's designed to look at new chemicals, because chemicals can't grow and reproduce. So there's a lot of ecological concerns that raises, that ability of a living thing to grow and reproduce, so that you would want to have appropriate regulations. And that's why a lot of the critics have maintained that we really need regulations in this country to deal with genetically engineered organisms. Part of the problem with trying to predict in the future what's going to happen with larger and larger scale releases of engineered organisms, unless the appropriate scientific studies are done, it's hard to say what's going to happen. You can come up with all sorts of theoretical scenarios of very bad things that could happen. We could, for example, with plants that are engineered to be resistant to pesticides, plants that are engineered to be resistant to Bt, for example. If the cotton bollworm becomes resistant to Bt, since it not only feeds on cotton, but it feeds on a lot of other plants as well, that means we won't be able to use Bt anymore. Bacillus thuringiensis is considered a fairly safe spray. Organic farmers can use it. If all of a sudden insects become resistant and you can't use that, well, that means people will be spraying other chemicals, and they'll probably be spraying ones that are nastier and more harmful both to the environment and to human health. So you could have an increase in pesticide residues on food. You could have all sorts of effect. It, in certain sense, depends on the organisms that you're putting out there. And we always have to realize there can be completely unexpected effects that people just don't realize beforehand. That's why you need to carefully evaluate things before they're released, because you don't want to find out that you have some kind of huge problem, that you've created some kind of horrible insect or weed or something, and then try to recall it. Because the one thing about living things is once you release them, it's hard to recall them.
Well, now, hasn't that, like that Percy Schmeiser kind of canola in Canada, that just Monsanto genetic engineered canola is just like spread over the whole state?
Well, actually, if you want to look, I think one of the big negative impacts, potential negative impacts of genetically engineered plants and animals, but we can talk about plants since they're out there, is, well, it's actually a problem right now, and it could grow even more so, is the United States, which has a very lax regulatory environment, is allowing more and more of these crops onto the market without adequate human safety or environmental safety testing. And other countries are saying, well, we haven't evaluated these things, so we're not going to, since they haven't been approved in our countries, if you won't segregate them, we won't buy from you anymore. So for example, if you look in Europe, there's only one variety or maybe two varieties of engineered corn that have been approved. In the US, we have at least a half a dozen varieties that have been approved of genetically engineered corn. Well, a number of those have not been approved in Europe, and since we do not segregate those corn varieties, it functionally means that Europe doesn't buy any corn from us anymore. So we had a $300 million a year market in corn in Europe. That's disappeared. With the Roundup Ready soybeans, in Europe, even though they're legal, the market doesn't really want that. Consumers seem to prefer genetically engineered free produce. So all over Europe, you have all these major supermarket chains all saying that they're going GE free or GMO free. That's what the market wants.
So are you seeing that that's also happening, or do you think that's going to happen with transgenic animals when fish are on the market or sheep are on the market?
Oh, absolutely. If we release genetically engineered salmon on the market in the U.S. and we don't require them to be labeled, there'll be people fighting to say they should be labeled, but any of those fish, if you tried to send them to Europe or Japan or many other countries where they've not been approved, they won't import them. You will not be able to sell them into these global markets. And so what I find ironic is the U.S. is pushing ahead trying to release more and more of these crops when the marketplace in all these other countries is saying we don't particularly want them because that's not what the market wants. That's not what the consumers want.
Okay.
So it's even happening in Africa. Africa now, South Africa is growing genetically engineered corn. Namibia, a state right next to Africa, exports a lot of beef, grows a lot of beef, and they export it to the European Union and to the United Kingdom. Well, the market in the United Kingdom and Europe is increasingly for meat, not only for foods that don't contain any genetically engineered ingredients, but people are now saying they would like to eat meat that has been, the animals have been fed on grain that has not been genetically engineered. I think that one of the major supermarket chains in the United Kingdom, Marks and Spencer, has said that they're going to be doing that. And so what Namibia has said is since the Europeans, the market that they sell into, they want beef that has come from animals that have not ever eaten any genetically engineered grain products. And so you're finding South Africa now can't export its grain to Namibia to be fed to cattle there. And the reason is, it's not necessarily because there's an identified health reason, it's the market in Europe is saying, we would like meat that comes from animals that have not been engineered. And so once labeling will happen in Europe, they're going to require labeling of all engineered foods, and I believe they're going to start being able to label for whether animals have been fed engineered foods or not. The market will make up its mind, and at least in Europe and Japan and other places, people don't seem to, the market seems to be very leery of these engineered crops. And so I find it ironic that the U.S. is pushing a technology that in many markets in other parts of the world they don't want. And in fact, the U.S. is trying to pressure countries to take this stuff.
Okay, and let's get then on to the next question, which is tell me the RBGH story.
Recombinant bovine growth hormone, or in the rest of the world it's called BST, or bovine somatotropin. That was a drug that was genetically engineered in bacteria, and it's injected into dairy cows to make them produce more milk. It's a cattle growth hormone. Although Monsanto, which got approval in the United States in '93, in November of 1993, and they started selling the product in February of 1994, they're the only manufacturer that is selling in the U.S. Their growth hormone, their bovine growth hormone, which the trade name is Posilac, is not identical to what the cow produces herself. It's actually slightly different. And there were concerns about both animal health, because the data was showing that when you inject cattle with bovine growth hormone, there's an increase in certain disease rates, such as mastitis, and it actually says that on the label that comes with the product. There was also concern about human health, that there were some suggestive evidence that the milk would contain bovine growth hormone is a growth hormone. The way it stimulates milk production is it doesn't do it through the growth hormone itself. What happens is the growth hormone stimulates the production of another growth factor called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor number 1. That's what actually stimulates the mammary glands and leads to the increased milk production. There's concern because there's increasing evidence that IGF-1 is being increasingly linked to a number of different forms of tumors, particularly colorectal cancers, breast cancer, lung cancer, and there's a fourth one that I'm forgetting. Let's see, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer. So there's some concern there, although the levels that appear to be associated with these various adverse health effects are higher than some of the levels you find in the milk, but there is still a concern that this molecule, IGF-1, would be problematic because the studies show that when you inject animals that are injected with bovine growth hormone compared to animals that are not injected, when you look at their milk, you get higher IGF-1 levels. So there's concern about that. There's also concern that since bovine growth hormone, when you inject it into animals, since there's an increase in disease rates, particularly mastitis. Mastitis is an inflammation of the udders in cattle. It is the major animal health problem in the U.S. About 1/3 of the cattle in the U.S. get treated for mastitis at least once a year. And mastitis rates go up in animals that are treated. If you look at the label that comes with the product, the label actually says use of Posilac is associated with increased frequency of medication to treat for mastitis and other health problems. So the label says that basically that antibiotics that are used against mastitis, that those more antibiotics will be used, and the concern is those could show up as residues in the milk, and that our monitoring programs for antibiotic resistance are not, for antibiotics in the milk are not adequate. So there was also concern that there could be increased drug residues in the milk.
So tell me, why is it that it is banned in every industrial country, but still used here in America?
Well, bovine growth hormone was approved in the U.S. went on sale in 1994. In Europe, there was a moratorium on its use between 1994 and the end of 1999. What happened in Europe is at the end of that moratorium, they turned the product down. They said, we're not going to approve it. And the argument they said is the data on animal health, the adverse effects on animal health, were enough to show that it should not be permitted on the market because they said it's unsafe to use on animals. Canada, also in January of 1999, they turned down bovine growth hormone and said we're not going to approve it for sale in Canada. And their argument was that it causes adverse animal health effects. So it's been primarily Europe, although Europe said we're turning it down on animal health grounds, but the Europeans were also concerned about potential human health implications and thought that those issues had not been adequately addressed. And I should also say that at the global level, we have the Codex Alimentarius. That's the food safety standards setting organization for the United Nations. It's a joint body between the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. And they've had a chance to declare bovine growth hormone safe, to say that a certain level can be used safely, and they've decided not to do that. And that's the reason that Codex decided that, was because there was not scientific consensus. The U.S. was saying that they thought the data was there to show that this product is safe for humans, and therefore we should set a level, any level should be permitted in milk. And the Europeans and actually other countries have said the scientific data is not there yet for us to declare it safe. And so there has been the Codex Alimentarius had a chance both in 1997 and 1999 to declare it to be safe, that is, to grant an maximum residue level, and they've both times declined.
Okay, now let's get into the Steve Wilson and Jane Aker aspect. Is they came up with their story presenting possible dangers, and so could you give me a relationship between commercial sponsor, commercial TV, news reporting these kind of presentation?
Well, bovine growth hormone in the U.S. is sold by Monsanto. Monsanto is a fairly aggressive company, and Monsanto does have a history of aggressively, for reporters and others that report on bovine growth hormone and try to bring up some of the negative side to that. Monsanto raises questions with reporters, with their editors and others, and what happened in Fox in the case of Steve Wilson and Jane Aker is these two investigative reporters came up with a series. They did their own investigation. They interviewed a bunch of people, and then the TV station was even promoting the piece because they thought it was going to be good. And then just a day before, all of a sudden there's a letter that goes to the head of Fox from one of Monsanto's lawyers saying that there might be stuff that's in there that is false or misleading, and sort of threatening that there might be legal action taken if Fox decided to air that. And so that's when all of a sudden Jane and Steve found themselves in this quandary of their bosses asking for changes. They went through this process of, I think, doing 74 changes, and they still didn't like it. So there was finally, they had to leave, and it appears that there was a lot of pressure brought to bear by Monsanto on Fox. Fox, of course, denies that, but at the court, when they went to court, the court did find in Jane's favor.
All right, but I didn't think it was a strictly Monsanto and legal action. I thought it was the milk industry and the pulling their the $5 million a year or whatever of their advertising. So I think that was a...
Oh, there's also, well, there has been, even though Monsanto is the major producer, there have been all sorts of organizations that they work with, the Animal Health Institute and National Milk Producers. So there's often all sorts of pressure that's brought to bear on any state that tries to do action. When states, for example, try to put in laws saying that they're going to require the milk to be labeled, even when small states try to do it, you'll always see an army of lawyers show up and lobbyists to try to stop that from happening. For genetically engineered animals, the Food and Drug Administration has clearly said that none of those animals should go onto the market until there's been an investigation of both the food safety and environmental safety. So the government agrees that before these animals can be released, that there has to be human safety testing and also environmental safety testing. But since the regulations don't exist, the first step is they have to publicly say how they're going to regulate. What exactly are the safety studies? What kind of data are they going to require for both human health and environmental health? And when they tell us, when they release publicly what those guidelines are, we will comment on them. But until there's specifics, we can't really say. But I can say that we hope, and the FDA has intimated that they don't plan to allow the release of any engineered animal until such time as these regulations are out there, because there's particular concern about the salmon. There's concern that the agency, the Food and Drug Administration, might approve the engineered salmon as safe for humans to eat and allow it to go onto the market even though they don't have any public regulations yet or tell us how they assess the safety. Because the other problem with regulating animals, genetically engineered animals, as new animal drugs is if you look at the new animal drug provision, all the data are confidential until the agency makes a decision. Okay? So we don't know exactly what the data is showing because it's all confidential. Whereas in the other parts of other agencies or in other parts of the FDA or with the Environmental Protection Agency, the whole process has to be open to the public. That is, the preliminary data becomes available, the public gets a chance to comment on it, and there's this back and forth. With drugs, that doesn't happen. That's all under secrecy. So there's a big problem there that's saying that they want to regulate these things as new animal drugs. There's no chance for public input and any kind of public oversight. So that means that that system is not very transparent, is not open, and so it's not being done with hardly any public participation, and that does not engender trust in the agencies at all. There is a very big problem with allowing industry money, the industry to do studies that are then used to get approval for these products. There isn't a simple answer because that's what's required when, for example, if you want to get a new drug on the market or a new pesticide on the market, the company has to generate all that data and submit it to the agencies. And then the agencies look at the data and see how well the studies are done and either accept or reject the studies to make their decision. On one hand, I don't think the public, that the public should be paying for, if a company wants to bring a new product out on the market, whether it's a drug or a pesticide or a genetically engineered animal, I don't think it's up to the public to be able, the public shouldn't have to pay for the safety testing. I think all the safety testing, that it is the responsibility of the industry to pay for all that. The problem comes with industry-funded studies can often influence the outcome of the study. So what's needed is the industry should be putting money into a pot someplace, which then any researcher who wants to look at the question can then get money from there so that there's an independence. Because even scientists will say that their research isn't influenced by where they get their money from, but the influence can happen in many subtle ways. I mean, besides the overt way of saying, well, I'm going to cynically give this company what it wants so that they'll give me more money, on a subtle way, there's things that work. If you're getting money from a drug company and you're doing studies for them and you find that there's a real big problem with one of their drugs, are they really going to want to come back and give you more money to do further research? So this whole problem of industry funding of research is very problematic because what's happening in the medical literature is there are now studies that are appearing that are showing that the results that you find in studies is often linked to where the money's coming from. So that means money that comes from pharmaceutical companies to work on a particular drug, those studies tend to find more positive effects from the drug than people that are studying that drug who don't get any money from the universities. And the scientists had always denied that any of this would happen because they said, are you questioning my integrity? You think that just because I take money from a company that I would do lower quality science? And even though scientists have said that for years, there is now actual, in the scientific literature, in the medical literature, there have been studies in the last 3 or 4 years on secondhand tobacco smoke, on the calcium channel blockers. There was a controversy there, and on a couple of other drugs. And the studies all clearly point out that source of funding has an impact on the results. So I think we have to figure out some way for there to be public investigation on all these safety issues. The money has to come from the industries, but it shouldn't come directly to the researchers from the industry, because then there is that problem of at least an appearance of a conflict of interest. That money has to go in to some kind of central source so that any scientist who wants to do appropriate studies can do it. Besides genetically engineered animals, there is increasing concern for what about clones? What about cloned animals? The meat and milk from clones. Should that go on the market or not? Because in a technical sense, a clone isn't a genetically engineered animal. And there's the Food and Drug Administration is saying with clones, they think that there should be some kind of safety or environmental testing. But there was an article in the international version of the Wall Street Journal on Friday, what was last Friday? November 23rd, on Friday, November 23rd, 2001, where there were some companies that were saying that they were already starting to distribute some cloned animals to other companies. And there don't appear to be any regulations on the books now that would prevent cloned animals or the milk or the meat from those animals from entering the marketplace.
So you think that it's a matter of biotechnology is advancing faster than societies and governmental regulations?
Well, very clearly, genetic engineering or biotechnology is moving at a faster clip than the regulations, because we are still lacking in regulations, appropriate regulations in this country. And I guess I would like to finally say that it turns out in late 2000, the Department of Interior actually looked at this issue, and they came up with findings where they felt that the environmental impacts of engineered organisms on all of them are completely not being looked at. They think that the legal requirements that the USDA uses, the Plant Pest Act, is not appropriate. They also do not think you can look at environmental impacts of animals by treating them as drugs. And they were proposing that there needs to be national legislation that is explicitly for how you go about doing environmental safety assessments for engineered organisms. Now, that never made it anywhere because President Bush came into power, but here we had actually one part of the government that was trying to develop very good regulations, and we think they should come out. I think there are two issues. On genetically engineered plants, some of what we're seeing now for the future that is even more problematic, given the Starlink fiasco, is the idea of there have been a number of field tests of producing drugs or industrial chemicals in plants and in corn plants. And if you're producing these chemicals in the plants, and many of them we don't know what they are, because again, that's confidential business information, but we do know, for example, between 1990 and 1999, there were 50 field tests of plants that were engineered to produce pharmaceutical products. Now, depending on what those drugs are, if those would accidentally, since with the Starlink corn, that was corn that farmers were supposed to sign contracts and it was never supposed to get into the human food supply, and we now find out that the human food supply, corn, is contaminated in all these products with Starlink. And if we couldn't keep Starlink out of the food supply, what about a corn plant that's engineered to produce some human drug? How are you going to keep that out of the food supply? And animals that are engineered to produce drugs in their milk, for example, what's going to stop some kind of mix-up from happening and maybe some of that milk getting into the regular market, or one of these animals mating with another animal and you get some kind of release? Then you can have all sorts of potential, both human health and environmental impacts. Because once you start to produce drugs and industrial chemicals and basically using plants or animals as factories to produce that stuff, there can be, we have to admit that there can be all sorts of accidents with these things getting out. And what would be the implications? For example, say someone decided to produce estrogen, have it be secreted in the milk of an animal, or human growth hormone. What's going to happen if somebody starts drinking that milk accidentally that has that drug in it? That would not be a good thing. And so even though they're moving forward with these pharmaceutical plants and animals, I think that the Starlink has to show us very clearly. There was a case where farmers were all going to sign contracts and this stuff was never going to get into the human food supply, and now it's all over the place. So if we couldn't keep Starlink out of the food supply, how are we going to keep corn that is engineered to produce pharmaceutical drugs from not also having that pollen move or get into the food supply in unexpected ways?